Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. And for today's episode, I will be looking at The Decline of the West, an abridged edition by Oswald Spengler. So this book was written in Germany in 1926. It was released in 1926. And I got a whole bunch of sections in this book that I want to read to you. Cool stuff in here. There's a lot in here that I'm not going to concern myself with, actually. Most of the stuff that I want to read is from the introduction. A lot of it is from the introduction. Because I just want to understand what his concept is of what a culture is and how cultures work. When he gets into the specifics about Apollonian, Faustian, Magian cultures and his ideas about the lifespans of these and the comparisons between them in architecture and literature and everything else, I don't really want to get into any of that. I'm not sure whether he's right or wrong, and I'm not really qualified to speak on it, but the way he conceives of cultures and the lifespans of cultures and the changes that cultures go through, that's the stuff that I want to focus on. So that's the stuff that I'm going to read. I also want to kind of compare this to the last episode, John Dewey's Reconstruction in Philosophy, because he had a really kind of forward-looking idea about the progress of technology and everything, and things of the past kind of, having all these leftover flaws in flawed thinking and stuff. And so he just kind of he saw this bright future of science ever expanding from its origin point to, whenever. He had a really, I guess, optimistic, progressive view of the future. And this clearly is the decline of the West and is a much more pessimistic view of our position in society and the definition of modernity and how his impression of modernity is versus Dewey's. And so I want to keep that in mind as well as I'm looking at these different sections. How does it compare to what Dewey said in his book? So in this section, he says, quote, "In this book is attempted for the first time the venture of predetermining history, of following the still untraveled stages in the destiny of a culture, and specifically of the only culture of our time and on our planet which is actually in the phase of fulfillment, the West European American. Is there a logic of history? Is there, beyond all the casual and incalculable elements of the separate events, something that we may call a metaphysical structure of historic humanity, something that is essentially independent of the outward forms, social, spiritual, and political, which we see so clearly? Are not these actualities indeed secondary, or derived from that something? Does world history present to the seeing eye certain grand traits again and again, with sufficient constancy to justify certain conclusions? And if so, what are the limits to which reasoning from such premises may be pushed? Is it possible to find in life itself? For human history is the sum of mighty life courses, which already have had to be endowed with ego and personality, in customary thought and expression, by predicating entities of a higher order, like the classical culture or the Chinese culture, modern civilization, a series of stages which must be traversed, and traversed moreover in an ordered and obligatory sequence. For everything organic, the notions of birth, death, youth, age, lifetime are fundamentals. May not these notions, in this sphere also, possess a rigorous meaning which no one has as yet extracted? In short, is all history founded upon general biographic archetypes? The decline of the West, which at first sight may appear, like the corresponding decline of the classical culture, a phenomenon limited in time and space, we now perceive to be a philosophical problem that, when comprehended in all its gravity, includes within itself every great question of being. If, therefore, we are to discover in what form the destiny of the Western culture will be accomplished, we must first be clear as to what culture is, what its relations are to visible history, to life, to soul, to nature, to intellect, what the forms of its manifestations are, and how far these forms, peoples, tongues and epochs, battles and ideas, states and gods, arts and craftworks, sciences, laws, economic types, and world ideas, great men and great events, may be accepted and pointed to as symbols. End quote. So that's his basic premise there. He's asking the question, is there a logic of history? Is there some process that all these different cultures are following? Some sort of ordered and obligatory sequence? He says for everything organic, the notions of birth, death, youth, age, lifetime are fundamentals. So if culture is organic, might not those notions also possess a rigorous meaning, which no one has yet extracted? He says, in short, is all history founded upon general biographic archetypes? Is there a structure to cultures and cultures in history, and is there a logic to history and a method in history that we can learn? That's his main question, and he brings up the decline of the West kind of as a given there, but he'll go into it in more detail. But he says that included in this question is every great question of being. Interesting. So an interesting thing to explore, probably worthwhile. So then proceeding from there shortly afterwards in the introduction, he says the following. He says, quote, "In this region," meaning history, he says, "in this region no one hitherto has set himself to work out a method, nor has had the slightest inkling that there is here a root, in fact the only root from which can come a broad solution of the problems of history. Analogies, insofar as they laid bare the organic structure of history, might be a blessing to historical thought. Their technique, developing under the influence of a comprehensive idea, would surely eventuate in inevitable conclusions and logical mastery. But as hitherto understood and practiced, they have been a curse, for they have enabled the historians to follow their own tastes, instead of soberly realizing that their first and hardest task was concerned with the symbolism of history and its analogies. Thus our theme, which originally comprised only the limited problem of present-day civilization, broadens itself into a new philosophy, the philosophy of the future, so far as the metaphysically exhausted soil of the West can bear such, and in any case the only philosophy which is within the possibilities of the West European mind in its next stages. It expands into the conception of a morphology of world history, of the world as history, in contrast to the morphology of the world as nature, that hitherto has been almost the only theme of philosophy. And it reviews once again the forms and movements of the world in their depth and final significance, but this time according to an entirely different ordering, which groups them not in an ensemble picture inclusive of everything known, but in a picture of life, and presents them not as things become, but as things becoming. The world as history, conceived, viewed, and given form from out of its opposite, the world as nature, here is a new aspect of human existence on this earth. And yet, in spite of its immense significance, both practical and theoretical, this aspect has not been realized, still less presented. Some obscure inkling of it there may have been, a distant, momentary glimpse there has often been, but no one has deliberately faced it and taken it in with all its implications. We have before us two possible ways in which man may inwardly possess and experience the world around him. With all rigor I distinguish, as to form, not substance, the organic from the mechanical world impression, the content of images from that of laws, the picture and symbol from the formula and the system, the instantly actual from the constantly possible, the intents and purposes of imagination ordering according to plan from the intents and purposes of experience, dissecting according to scheme. And to mention even this early an opposition that has never yet been noted in spite of its significance, the domain of chronological from that of mathematical number. Consequently, in a research such as that lying before us, there can be no question of taking spiritual political events, as they become visible day by day on the surface, at their face value, and arranging them on a scheme of causes or effects, and following them up in the obvious and intellectually easy directions. Such a pragmatic handling of history would be nothing but a piece of natural science in disguise, and for their part the supporters of the materialistic idea of history make no secret about it. It is their adversaries who largely fail to see the similarity of the two methods. What concerns us is not what the historical facts which appear at this or that time are, per se, but what they signify, what they point to by appearing. I have not hitherto found one who has carefully considered the morphological relationship that inwardly binds together the expression forms of all branches of a culture. Yet viewed from this morphological standpoint, even the humdrum facts of politics assume a symbolic and even a metaphysical character. And what has perhaps been impossible hitherto, things such as the Egyptian administrative state, the classical coinage, analytical geometry, the check, the Suez Canal, the book printing of the Chinese, the Prussian army, and the Roman road engineering, can as symbols be made uniformly understandable and appreciable. But at once the fact presents itself that, as yet, there exists no theory-enlightened art of historical treatment. What passes as such draws its methods almost exclusively from the domain of that science which alone has completely disciplined the methods of cognition, namely physics. And thus we imagine ourselves to be carrying on historical research when we are really following out objective connections of cause and effect. Judged by the standards of the physicist and the mathematician, the historian becomes careless as soon as he has assembled and orders his material and passes on to interpretation. That there is, besides a necessity of cause and effect, which I may call the logic of space, another necessity, an organic necessity in life, that of destiny, the logic of time, is a fact of the deepest inward certainty, a fact which suffuses the whole of mythological religions and artistic thought, and constitutes the essence and kernel of all history in contradistinction to nature, but is unapproachable through the cognition forms which the Critique of Pure Reason investigates. This fact still awaits its theoretical formulation." End quote. So that's the second part of the introduction there. He's just like breaking down all his basic ideas. Here he brings up the world as history. He brings up a whole bunch of stuff quickly, but he's talked about how nobody has worked yet to set out a method, a morphology or a study of shape of world history. The world as history, in contrast to the morphology of the world as nature, which is cause and effect. He aligns cause and effect study with the study of the world as nature, and this is related to the study of the world in space. So this is a study of like three-dimensional space and matter in sort of as prioritized over the passage of time, where the world as history is an experience of the world that is prioritizing the experience of time, and doesn't look at things in terms of cause and effect like that, but in the terms of destiny. He says, "There is, besides a necessity of cause and effect, which I may call the logic of space, another necessity, an organic necessity in life, that of destiny. The logic of time is a fact of the deepest inward certainty." And that's how he wants to look at history, and that's what causes him to separate it out into these particular historical cultures. This one, followed by this one, followed by this one. Kind of like waves passing through human civilization, the human race, these waves of culture that rise up to their zenith and then pass away. And so there's a sort of like a structure that each culture goes through, where it goes through birth, life, and death. And he basically argues that the Faustian culture is experiencing its decline and death, and a new culture is being born that hasn't really been identified yet. So the decline of the West is the decline of Faustian Western Europe, the Western civilization. So, continuing on with some of the contents of the introduction, he gets on where he starts talking about the rhythm of life, which is where he gets the concept of, the coming and going, passing and cycling of the archetypes of culture. So here he says, quote, "We know it to be true of every organism that the rhythm, form, and duration of its life, and all the expression details of that life as well, are determined by the properties of its species. No one, looking at the oak with its millennial life, dare say that it is at this moment now about to start on its true and proper course. No one, as he sees a caterpillar grow day to day, expects that it will go on doing so for 2 or 3 years. In these cases we feel, with an unqualified certainty, a limit, and this sense of the limit is identical with our sense of the inward form. In the case of higher human history, on the contrary, we take our ideas as to the course of the future from an unbridled optimism that sets at naught all historic, i.e. organic, experience, and everyone therefore sets himself to discover in the accidental present terms that he can expand into some striking progression series, the existence of which rests not on scientific proof but on predilection. Mankind, however, has no aim, no idea, no plan, any more than the family of butterflies or orchids. Mankind is a zoological expression, or an empty word, but conjure away the phantom, break the magic circle, and at once there emerges an astonishing wealth of actual forms, the living, with all its immense fullness, depth, and movement, hitherto veiled by a catchword, a dry-as-dust scheme, and a set of personal ideals. I see, in place of that empty figment of one linear history, which can be kept up only by shutting one's eyes to the overwhelming multitude of the facts, the drama of a number of mighty cultures, each springing with primitive strength from the soil of a mother region, to which it remains firmly bound throughout its whole life cycle, each stamping its material, its mankind, in its own image, each having its own idea, its own passions, its own life, will, and feeling, its own death. Here, indeed, are colors, lights, movements that no intellectual eye has yet discovered. Here, the cultures, peoples, languages, truths, gods, landscapes, bloom and age as the oaks and the pines, the blossoms, twigs, and leaves, but there is no aging mankind. Each culture has its own new possibilities of self-expression which arise, ripen, decay, and never return. There is not one sculpture, one painting, one mathematics, one physics, but many, each in its deepest essence different from the others, each limited in duration and self-contained, just as each species of plant has its peculiar blossom or fruit, its special type of growth and decline. These cultures, sublimated life essences, grow with the same superb aimlessness as the flowers of the field. They belong, like the plants and the animals, to the living nature of Goethe, and not to the dead nature of Newton. I see world history as a picture of endless formations and transformations, of the marvelous waxing and waning of organic forms. The professional historian, on the contrary, sees it as a sort of tapeworm, industriously adding on to itself, one epoch after another." End quote. So I like that section. He really talks about the organic kind of plant-like nature of these perpetually blooming cultures of all sort with no rhyme or reason springing up, around the world, each one springing out of a connection with its motherland. and having its own image, its own idea, its own passions, its own life, will, feeling, and its own death. I think it's a cool image. So moving on from there. So in this section here, this is a section entitled The Problem of Civilization. He makes a distinction between culture and civilization, and it's an important distinction. So in this part he says, quote, "The decline of the West comprises nothing less than the problem of civilization. We have before us one of the fundamental questions of all higher history. What is civilization? Understood as the organico-logical sequel, fulfillment, and finale of a culture. For every culture has its own civilization. In this work, for the first time, the two words, hitherto used to express an indefinite, more or less ethical distinction, are used in a periodic sense, to express a strict and necessary organic succession. The civilization is the inevitable destiny of the culture. And in this principle we obtain the viewpoint from which the deepest and gravest problems of historical morphology become capable of solution. Civilizations are the most external and artificial states of which a species of developed humanity is capable. They are a conclusion, the thing become, succeeding the thing becoming, death following life, rigidity following expansion, intellectual age and the stone-built petrifying world city following Mother Earth and the spiritual childhood of Doric and Gothic. They are an end, irrevocable, yet by inward necessity reached again and again. So, for the first time, we are enabled to understand the Romans as the successors of the Greeks, and light is projected into the deepest secrets of the late classical period. What but this can be the meaning of the fact, which can only be disputed by vain phrases, that the Romans were barbarians who did not precede but closed a great development? Unspiritual, unphilosophical, devoid of art, clannish to the point of brutality, aiming relentlessly at tangible successes, they stand between the Hellenic culture and nothingness. An imagination directed purely to practical objects was something which is not found at all in Athens. In a word, Greek soul, Roman intellect. And this antithesis is the differentia between culture and civilization. Nor is it only to the classical that it applies. Again and again there appears this type of strong-minded, completely non-metaphysical man, and in the hands of this type lies the intellectual and material destiny of each and every late period. Pure civilization, as a historical process, consists in a progressive exhaustion of forms that have become inorganic or dead. The transition from culture to civilization was accomplished for the classical world in the 4th, for the Western in the 19th century. From these periods onward, the great intellectual decisions take place, no longer all over the world, where not a hamlet is too small to be unimportant, but in 3 or 4 world cities that have absorbed into themselves the whole content of history, while the old wide landscape of the culture, become merely provincial, serves only to feed the cities with what remains of its higher mankind. World city and province, the two basic ideas of every civilization, bring up a wholly new form problem of history, the very problem that we are living through today, with hardly the remotest conception of its immensity. In place of a world, there is a city, a point, in which the whole life of broad regions is collecting, while the rest dries up. In place of a type-true people, born of and grown on the soil, there is a new sort of nomad, cohering unstably in fluid masses, the parasitical city-dweller, traditionless, utterly matter-of-fact, religionless, clever, unfruitful, deeply contemptuous of the countryman, and especially that highest form of countryman, the country gentleman. This is a very great stride toward the inorganic, toward the end. What does it signify? The world city means cosmopolitanism in place of home. To the world city belongs not a folk, but a mob. Its uncomprehending hostility to all the traditions representative of the culture nobility, church, privileges, dynasties, convention in art, and limits of knowledge in science. The keen and cold intelligence that confounds the wisdom of the peasant, the new-fashioned naturalism that in relation to all matters of sex and society goes back far to quite primitive instincts and conditions, the reappearance of the bread and circuses in the form of wage disputes and sports stadia. All of these things betoken the definite closing down of the culture and the opening of a quite new phase of human existence, anti-provincial, late, futureless, but quite inevitable." End quote. So there is a pretty solid section. He talks about the difference between culture and civilization, culture being the growing portion of time, and the civilization, which I guess culture is what the whole thing is, but implied here is that it's the early stages, the growing stages, and then it turns into a civilization in its old dying stages when it has its bread and circuses and everything is dead and static and in the form of some sort of single city where all the power is centralized. Civilization. The separation between the city and the countryside. And that's basically the end point. And moving on from there, so there's this one part here where, when you're in school and they tell you that you have to put your theme in your paper into a single sentence, I think this is it. This is the sentence that states the whole theme of the book. Cluing me in also is the following section immediately afterwards, which I'm also going to read, is called Significance of the Main Theme. But he says the following, quote, "The future of the West is not a limitless tending upwards and onwards for all time towards our present ideals, but a single phenomenon of history, strictly limited and defined as to form and duration, which covers a few centuries and can be viewed and, in essentials, calculated from available precedents. This high plane of contemplation once attained, the rest is easy. To this single idea one can refer, and by it one can solve, without straining or forcing, all those separate problems of religion, art history, epistemology, ethics, politics, economics, with which the modern intellect has so passionately and so vainly busied itself for decades. This idea is one of those truths that have only to be expressed with full clarity to become indisputable. It is one of the inward necessities of the Western culture and of its world feeling. Up to now, everyone has been at liberty to hope what he pleased about the future. Where there are no facts, sentiment rules. But henceforward it will be every man's business to inform himself of what can happen, and therefore of what, with the unalterable necessity of destiny and irrespective of personal ideals, hopes, or desires, will happen. When we use the risky word freedom, we shall mean freedom to do not this or that, but the necessary or nothing. The feeling that this is just as it should be is the hallmark of the man of fact. To lament it and blame it is not to alter it. To birth belongs death, to youth age, to life generally its form and its allotted span. The present is a civilized, emphatically not a cultured, time period. It will no doubt be objected that such a world outlook, which in giving this certainty as to the outlines and tendency of the future cuts off all far-reaching hopes, would be unhealthy for all and fatal for many, once it ceased to be a mere theory and was adopted as a practical scheme of life by the group of personalities effectively molding the future. Such is not my opinion. We are civilized, not Gothic or Rococo people. We have to reckon with the hard, cold facts of a late life, to which the parallel is to be found not in Pericles' Athens, but in Caesar's Rome. Of great painting or great music there can no longer be, for Western people, any question. Their architectural possibilities have been exhausted these 100 years. Only extensive possibilities are left to them. Yet for a sound and vigorous generation that is filled with unlimited hopes, I fail to see that it is any disadvantage to discover betimes that some of those hopes must come to nothing. And if the hopes thus doomed should be those most dear, well, a man who is worth anything will not be dismayed. End quote. So yeah, he's just like, this is how it is. You best deal with it. Take your medicine. Don't cry about it. Everything is as it is. To birth belongs death. To youth, age. To life, generally, its form and its allotted span. The present is a civilized, emphatically not a cultured time period. So we are in the civilization stage, not the culture stage. We are inevitably on the downward slope, is his argument. Okay? And one thing that I think that's interesting about that is when you consider what exactly each of these cultures is. Like the various people that comprise the various cultures that he describes, they're all still here. They're not all dead. It's not like their whole, ethnic group or whatever is dead. It's that there was a moment in time when a certain people flourished in a certain way, and their culture expanded and gained renown and power, and that was the birth and ripening of the civilization or the culture. And then it ossified, it calcified, it lost its power, it lost its creativity, and that was the civilization phase, and it was all about just hanging on to whatever power it had already acquired. So in this section, which I'm fond of, he compares humanity to like a river, and these cultural uprisings that I'm describing as like waves in the river or events in this river of people. He says, quote, "A boundless mass of human being flowing in a stream without banks. Upstream, a dark past wherein our time sense loses all powers of definition, and restless or uneasy fancy conjures up geological periods to hide away an eternally unsolvable riddle. Downstream, a future even so dark and timeless, such is the groundwork of the Faustian picture of human history. Over the expanse of the water, past the endless uniform ripples of the generations. Here and there bright shafts of light broaden out. Everywhere dancing flashes confuse and disturb the clear mirror, changing, sparkling, vanishing. These are what we call the clans, tribes, peoples, races, which unify a series of generations within this or that limited area of the historical surface. As widely as these differ in creative power, so widely do the images that they create vary in duration and plasticity. And when the creative power dies out, the physiognomic, linguistic, and spiritual identification marks vanish also, and the phenomenon subsides again into the ruck of the generations. Aryans, Mongols, Germans, Celts, Parthians, Franks, Carthaginians, Berbers, Bantus are names by which we specify some very heterogeneous images of this order. But over the surface, too, the great cultures accomplish their majestic wave cycles. They appear suddenly, swell in splendid lines, flatten again and vanish, and the face of the waters is once more a sleeping waste. A culture is born in the moment when a great soul awakens out of the proto-spirituality of ever-childish humanity, and detaches itself, a form from the formless, a bounded and mortal thing from the boundless and enduring. It blooms on the soil of an exactly definable landscape, to which, plant-wise, it remains bound. It dies when this soul has actualized the full sum of its possibilities in the shape of peoples, languages, dogmas, arts, states, sciences, and reverts into the proto-soul. But its living existence, that sequence of great epics which define and display the stages of fulfillment, is an inner passionate struggle to maintain the idea against the powers of chaos without and the unconscious muttering deep down within. It is not only the artist who struggles against the resistance of the material and the stifling of the idea within him. Every culture stands in a deeply symbolical, almost in a mystical relation to the extended, the space in which and through which it strives to actualize itself. The aim once attained, the idea, the entire content of inner possibilities, fulfilled and made externally actual, the culture suddenly hardens, it mortifies, its blood congeals, its force breaks down, and it becomes civilization. The thing which we feel and understand in the words Egyptism, Byzantinism, Mandaриnism. As such, it may, like a worn-out giant of the primeval forest, thrust decaying branches towards the sky for hundreds of thousands of years, as we see in China, in India, in the Islamic world. It was thus that the classical civilization rose gigantic in the imperial age with a false semblance of youth and strength and fullness, and robbed the young Arabian culture of the East of light and air. This, the inward and outward fulfillment, the finality that awaits every living culture, is the purport of all the historic declines, among them that decline of the classical, which we know so well and fully, and another decline, entirely comparable to it in course and duration, which will occupy the first centuries of the coming millennium, but is heralded already and sensible in and around us today, the decline of the West. Every culture passes through the age phases of the individual man. Each has its childhood, youth, manhood, and old age. It is a young and trembling soul, heavy with misgivings, that reveals itself in the morning of Romanesque and Gothic. It fills the Faustian landscape from the province of the troubadours to the Hildesheim Cathedral of Bishop Bernwald. The spring wind blows over it. Childhood speaks to us also, and in the same tones, out of early Homeric Doric, out of early Christian, which is really early Arabian art, and out of the works of the old kingdom in Egypt that began with the 4th dynasty. A mythic world consciousness is fighting like a harassed debtor against the dark and demonic in itself and in nature, while slowly ripening itself for the pure, day-bright expression of the existence that it will at last achieve and know. The more nearly a culture approaches the noon culmination of its being, the more virile, austere, controlled, intense the form language it has secured for itself, the more assured its sense of its own power, the clearer its lineaments. We find every individual trait of expression deliberate, strict, measured, marvelous in its ease and self-confidence, and everywhere, at moments, the coming fulfillment suggested. End quote. That's the section where he talks about, well, he opens it up at least with the talk about a human river and these ripples, and then he kind of switches to talking about water, but seeing each wave, all of the waves as rising and falling of these cultures. And he also says that a culture is born in the moment when a great soul awakens out of the proto-spirituality of ever-childish humanity and detaches itself, a form from the formless, a bounded and mortal thing from the boundless and enduring. It's kind of like the soul of a culture, a great soul. I think that he does think that great men with great ideas can bring forth, but I suppose in that section he's really talking about the soul of a culture as an individual thing, which is interesting. In this next section, he talks about, this is a fairly brief section, he talks about the individuality of different cultures, and he says, quote, "Every culture possesses a wholly individual way of looking at and comprehending the world as nature, or what comes to the same thing. It has its own peculiar nature which no other sort of man can possess in exactly the same form. But in a far greater degree still, every culture, including the individuals comprising it, who are separated only by minor distinctions, possess a specific and peculiar sort of history. But it is difficult enough to form an exact idea, even of the nature proper to another kind of man, although in this domain things specifically cognizable are causally ordered and unified in a communicable system, and it is quite impossible for us to penetrate completely a historic world aspect of becoming, formed by a soul that is quite differently constituted from our own. Here there must always be an intractable residue, greater or smaller, in proportion to our historical instinct, physiognomic tact, and knowledge of men. All the same, the solution of this very problem is the condition precedent of all really deep misunderstanding of the world." End quote. It's like people of different cultures have different ways of being, different ways of interacting with the world. And, you're born into a culture and you just absorb this stuff, without intending to. And people from other cultures are never going to, depending on the contact between the cultures, but, for like isolated cultures, they're never going to completely be able to understand each other because they just have such different ways of being in the world and the symbol systems. In this section here, actually, is when he talks about symbols. So in this section, he says, quote, "Symbols are sensible signs, final, indivisible, and above all, unsought impressions of definite meaning. A symbol is a trait of actuality that for the sensuously alert man has an immediate and inwardly sure significance, and that is incommunicable by process of reason. The detail of a Doric or early Arabic or early Romanesque ornament, the forms of the cottage and the family, of intercourse, of costume and rite, the aspect, gait, and mien of a man, or of whole classes of peoples and men, the communication and community forms of man and beast, and beyond all this the whole voiceless language of nature, with her woods and pastures, flocks, clouds, stars, moonlight, and thunderstorm, bloom and decay, nearness and distance. All this is the emblematical impression of the cosmos upon us, who are both aware and in our reflective hours quite capable of listening to this language. When we wake up at once, something interposes between a here and a there. We live the here as something proper to ourselves. We experience the there as something alien. There is a dualizing of soul and world as poles of actuality, and in the latter there are both resistances which we grasp causally as things and properties, and impulses in which we feel beings, noumena, just like ourselves, to be operative. But there is in it, further, something which, as it were, eliminates the duality. Actuality, the world in relation to a soul, is for every individual the projection of the directed upon the domain of the extended, the proper mirroring itself onto the alien. One's actuality then signifies oneself. By an act that is both creative and unconscious, for it is not an I who actualize the possible, but it actualizes itself through me. The bridge of symbol is thrown between the living here and there. Suddenly, necessarily, and completely, the world comes into being out of the totality of received and remembered elements. And it is as an individual who apprehends the world, there is for each individual a singular world. There are therefore as many worlds as there are waking beings, and like living, like feeling groups of beings. The supposedly single, independent, and external world that each believes to be common to all is really an ever-new, uniquely occurring, and non-recurring experience of the existence of each. This is the idea of the macrocosm, actuality as the sum total of all symbols in relation to one soul. From this property of being significant, nothing is exempt. All that is symbolizes. From the corporeal phenomena like visage, shape, mien of individuals and classes and peoples alike, which have always been known to possess meaning, to the supposedly eternal and universally valid forms of knowledge, mathematics and physics. Everything speaks out of the essence of one and only one soul. At the same time, these individuals' worlds, as lived and experienced by men of one culture or spiritual community, are interrelated, and on the greater or less degree of this interrelation depends the greater or less communicability of intuitions, sensations, and thoughts from one to another, that is, the possibility of making intelligible what one has created in the style of one's own being, through expression media such as language or art or religion, by means of word sounds or formula or signs that are themselves also symbols. The degree of interrelation between one's world and another's fixes the limit at which understanding becomes self-deception. Certainly it is only very imperfectly that we can understand the Indian or the Egyptian soul, as manifested in the men, customs, deities, root words, ideas, beings, and acts of it. End quote. So he mentions here, so he talks about symbols, and he starts off with saying that when we wake up at once, something interposes between a here and a there. We live the here as something proper to ourselves. We experience the there as something alien. That we're right off the bat, a priori, born with this mental distinction between the here and the there, the self and everything other than the self. He says there's a dualizing of soul and world as poles of actuality. And in the latter there are both resistances which we grasp causally as things and properties, and impulses in which we feel beings to be operative. He talks about the macrocosm. He brings the macrocosm up and he says that it is actuality as the sum total of all symbols in relation to one soul. So it seems like there's the entirety of everything which one person experiences. Each person has their own macrocosm. But then he says, at the same time, these individuals' worlds, as lived and experienced by men of one culture or spiritual community, are interrelated. And on the greater or less degree of this interrelation depends the greater or less communicability of intuitions, sensations, and thoughts from one to the other. So, at the same time, there is a unified culture that has its own sort of soul, as he spoke of previously, its own way of being. He does say, when he's talking about the here and the there, he does say that by an act that is both creative and unconscious, for it is not I who actualize the possible, but it actualizes itself through me, the bridge of symbol is thrown between the living here and there. Suddenly, necessarily, and completely, the world comes into being out of the totality of received and remembered elements. So all these things, this macrocosm is all of the symbols, the sum total of all the symbols, not the sum total of all the phenomena. The sum total of all the phenomena is the there, and symbol is used to connect the here or the I with the there or everything else, the phenomena, structured into symbolic forms in order to connect an individual mind with the world. And all of the set of symbols that are used to create this connection between the here, the self, and the there, and everything else, all that set of symbols is the macrocosm. And so then the culture itself, being a set of symbols, is like the macrocosm. It's the aggregate of all of the people's individual symbolic macrocosms. That's how I'm understanding that section. I got a couple more sections I want to read, and this one here is called The Inner Mythology. So in this section, he says, quote, "For every man, whatever the culture to which he belongs, the elements of the soul are the deities of an inner mythology. What Zeus was for the outer Olympus, Nous was for the inner world that every Greek was entirely conscious of possessing, the throned lord of the other soul elements. What God is for us, God as breath of the world, the universal power, the ever-present doer and provider, that also, reflected from the space of world into the imaginary space of soul and necessarily felt as an actual presence, is will. In the Baroque age, the pantheism of the outer world is immediately resulted in one of the inner world also. And the word God, in antithesis to world, has always, however interpreted in this or that case, implied exactly what is implied in the word will with respect to soul, namely the power that moves all that is within its domain. Thought no sooner leaves religion for science than we get the double myth of concepts in physics and psychology. The concepts, force, mass, will, passion, rest not on objective experience, but on a life feeling. Darwinism is nothing but a specially shallow formulation of this feeling. No Greek would have used the word nature, as our biology employs it, in the sense of an absolute and methodical activity. The will of God for us is a pleonasm. God, or nature as some say, is nothing but will. Zeus emphatically does not possess full powers over the world, but is simply first among equals, a body amongst bodies, as the Apollonian world feeling requires. Blind necessity, the ananke, immanent in the cosmos of classical consciousness, is in no sense dependent upon him. On the contrary, the gods are subordinate to it. Aeschylus says so outright in a powerful passage of the Prometheus, but it is perceptible even in Homer, for example in the strife of the gods and in that decisive passage in which Zeus takes up the scales of destiny, not to settle, but to learn the fate of Hector. The classical soul, therefore, with its parts and its properties, imagines itself as an Olympus of little gods, and to keep these at peace and in harmony with one another is the ideal of the Greek life ethic of sophrosony and ataraxia. More than one of the philosophers betrays the connection by calling nous, the highest part of the soul, Zeus. Aristotle assigns to his deity the single function of theoria, contemplation, and this is Diogenes' ideal also, a completely matured static of life in contrast to the equally ripe dynamic of our 18th century ideal. End quote. So he says that like the concept of the will is a reflection in the mind of the concept of God as this all-driving powerful force, whereas in the ancient world, Zeus didn't fill the same role as this all-powerful entity in the same way, and in the mind, nous, the mental equivalent, doesn't play that same role either, but it is, he says, Zeus emphatically does not possess full powers over the world, but is simply the first among equals, a body amongst bodies, as the Apollonian world feeling requires. Blind necessity. The ananke immanent in the cosmos of classical consciousness, we talked about that in a previous episode, the one on Parmenides, is in no sense dependent upon him, on Zeus, but Zeus and the gods are all subordinate to Ananke. But Ananke is kind of behind the scenes. Ananke is not the king of, or the queen of the gods, even though she is superior and more primordial and more fundamental than the gods, and they are in fact subordinate to her, which is an interesting examination of how that's all arranged. Very interesting indeed. Moving right along, I'm just going to read this section. The section is entitled "The Morale of Dawning Civilization," or I suppose he's really talking more about the transformation into civilization of the previous culture. Maybe that's why he doesn't say anything about what comes next really at all. Well, in this section he says, quote, "When Nietzsche wrote down the phrase transvaluation of all values, for the first time the spiritual movement of the centuries in which we are living found at last its formula. Transvaluation of all values is the most fundamental character of every civilization. For it is in the beginning of a civilization that it remolds all the forms of the culture that went before, understands them otherwise, practices them in a different way. It begets no more, but only reinterprets. And herein lies the negativeness common to all periods of this character. It assumes that the genuine act of creation has already occurred, and merely enters upon an inheritance of big actualities. In the late classical, we find the same taking place inside Hellenistic Roman Stoicism, that is, the long death struggle of the Apollonian soul. In the interval from Socrates, who was the spiritual father of the Stoa and in whom the first signs of inward impoverishment and city intellectualism became visible, to Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, every existential ideal of the old classical underwent transvaluation. In the case of India, the transvaluation of Brahmin life was complete by the time of King Osaka, 250 BC, as we can see by comparing the parts of the Vedanta put into writing before and after Buddha. And ourselves? Even now, the ethical socialism of the Faustian soul, its fundamental ethic, as we have seen, is being worked upon by the process of transvaluation, as that soul is walled up in the stone of the great cities. Rousseau is the ancestor of this socialism. He stands, like Socrates and Buddha, as the representative spokesman of a great civilization. Rousseau's rejection of all great culture forms and all significant conventions, his famous return to the state of nature, his practical rationalism, are unmistakable evidences. Each of the three buried a millennium of spiritual depth. Each proclaimed his gospel to mankind, but it was to the mankind of the city intelligentsia, which was tired of the town and the late culture, and whose pure, i.e. soulless, reason longed to be free from them and their authoritative form and their severity, from the symbolism with which it was no longer in living communion, and which therefore it detested. The culture was annihilated by dialectic. Socrates was a nihilist and Buddha. There was an Egyptian or an Arabian or a Chinese desouling of the human being, just as there is a Western. This is a matter not of mere political and economic, nor even of religious and artistic transformations, nor of any tangible or factual change whatsoever, but of the condition of a soul after it has actualized its possibilities in full. Culture and civilization. The living body of a soul and the mummy of it. For Western existence, the distinction lies at about the year 1800. On the one side of that frontier, life in fullness and sureness of itself, formed by growth from within, in one great, uninterrupted evolution from Gothic childhood to Goethe and Napoleon. And on the other, the autumnal, artificial, rootless life of our great cities, under forms fashioned by the intellect. Culture man lives inwards, civilization man outwards in space and among bodies and facts. That which one feels deeply as destiny, the other understands as a linkage of causes and effects. And thenceforward he is a materialist in the sense of the word, valid for and only valid for civilization, whether he wills it or no, and whether Buddhist, Stoic, or socialist doctrines wear the garb of religion or not. Only the sick man feels his limbs. When men construct an unmetaphysical religion in opposition to cults and dogmas, when a natural law is set up against historical law, when, in arts, styles are invented in place of the style that can no longer be born or mastered, when men conceive of the state as an order of society which not only can but must be altered, then it is evident that something has definitely broken down. The cosmopolis itself, the supreme inorganic, is there, settled in the midst of the culture landscape, whose men it is uprooting, drawing into itself, and using up. So long as the man of a culture that is approaching its fulfillment still continues to follow straight onwards naturally and unquestioningly, his life has a settled conduct. This is the instinctive morale, which may disguise itself in 1,000 controversial forms, but which he himself does not controvert because he has it. As soon as life is fatigued, as soon as a man is put on to the artificial soil of great cities, which are intellectual worlds to themselves, and needs a theory in which suitably to present life to himself, morale turns into a problem. As late as Plato and as late as Kant, ethics are still mere dialectics, a game with concepts on the rounding off of a metaphysical system, something that at bottom would not be thought really necessary. The categorical imperative is merely an abstract statement of what, for Kant, was not in question at all. But with Zeno, and with Schopenhauer, this is no longer so. It has become necessary to discover, to invent, or to squeeze into form, as a rule of being, that which was no longer anchored in instinct, and at this point, therefore, begin the civilized ethics that are no longer the reflection of life, but the reflection of knowledge upon life. One feels that there is something artificial, soulless, half-true in all these considered systems that fill the first centuries of all the civilizations. They are not those profound and almost unearthly creations that are worthy to rank with the great arts. All metaphysic of the high style, all pure intuition, vanishes before the one need that has suddenly made itself felt, the need of a practical morale for the governance of a life that can no longer govern itself. Up to Kant, up to Aristotle, up to the Yoga and Vedanta doctrines, philosophy has been a sequence of grand world systems, in which formal ethics occupied a very modest place. But now it became moral philosophy, with a metaphysic as background. The enthusiasm of epistemology had to give way to hard practical needs. Socialism, Stoicism, and Buddhism are philosophies of this type. End quote. Okay, so in that section, that was a rather long, actually that was a super long section. So in that section, he's essentially saying that Rousseau is the ancestor of the socialism of civilization. The end state of Western civilization is heralded by Rousseau because of all of his rejection of great culture forms and all significant conventions. His attempt to overturn everything that had come before him signaled see, this is the thing, I'm starting to get into the section of the book where he talks about the specifics of Faustian culture and the specifics of Magian culture. And if he has Rousseau kind of heralding the beginning of the civilization phase, that's the end of the 18th century. He has Goethe as the pinnacle of it. It seems like at this point we must just be dragging it out remarkably long, and there's not really anything in here about what is coming to arise to be the next major civilization. I suppose this is written 100 years ago, so who knows? Anyway, that's all. I'm not going to do any more major interpretation. I just think it's really interesting to kind of see the kind of a biological look at cultures as quasi biological entities in a way. But one thing that I thought was interesting was how he talks about cause and effect and destiny. And one thing that I was thinking about that was that the fact that you're a mortal being and you know that you're going to die. And it might be the case that you'll know why you're going to die because you've got some disease that's doing something, or after you die you can be looked at and understood what disease you had, or the autopsy will tell you how you died. The fact that you die is pretty much understood by a sequence of cause and effect, things that happened. This happened, and then therefore that person died, and we can say pretty accurately what the process is, maybe with not 100% accuracy all the time, depending on how accurate one could potentially get. But in the past, it might have been more the case that somebody would die and they wouldn't really know exactly how the person died, or like if you're dying of old age, like what somebody is dying of when they're dying of old age, what is happening specifically. People back in the day couldn't really understand, especially like something, obviously getting your head chopped off is going to kill you, and they could probably draw that conclusion, but dying of old age, they might not have had an exact answer from a cause and effect perspective of why somebody died, and yet they believed that everybody died, and it served them well to believe that everybody died. It wasn't a useful belief to constantly question that, whether or not they had a cause and effect explanation of it. And that sense of what is going to happen was based on observing that everybody else died, and so it was probably most likely that everybody dies. It's kind of not a super far leap to make, but there was no real evidence of it, and there was no explanation as to exactly how that old age death occurs. And so I think it becomes a different type of knowledge that people. It still is remarkably useful to have that understanding, but it's a different type of knowledge, and it's a knowledge that your destiny is to die. That everything has a future that is fated to it through destiny, and that's really all that had to be, plugged in for a knowledge system, absent the concept of cause and effect. But if you get so hooked into cause and effect that you start to forget that you don't know everything, and I think that some concept of fate in some form may continue to be helpful to sort of plug the gaps for the things that we don't know. I don't know. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. Talk to you next time.